basically. I wanted to be able to share the truth of the faith and the joy of the faith and the answers and the questions with everyone I knew. And there are a lot of great books out there, but there weren't many books that I felt comfortable sharing with my friends. So it was a book that you could give to just about anybody, that they would actually read it because it's funny, because it's, you know, Ann B. Davis likes it. You know, it's just sort of, it's mainstream. It's not so serious. We know there are good books. There's, you know, Chesterton, and there's John Stott, and there's C.S. Lewis, but I know a lot of people who won't read those books because it's just not their cup of tea.
Right.
Well, I wanted to write something that if I gave it to somebody, they actually would read it, and it wouldn't try to corner them into accepting the faith, but that it would just open a dialogue, just like what happened to me, because I really believe if you're searching for the truth, you will find God. We don't have to force people.
What impact did researching Wilberforce have on you? I mean, Amazing Grace is an amazing book, but also it became an amazing movie. But, you know, you start from ground zero and you start reading your very first words about Wilberforce, and you're sucked into the vortex, really, of this incredible life. How did you come out on the other side of your research on Wilberforce?
Well, Wilberforce, there's so much to be said there. In fact, the way that I was led to writing about Wilberforce was as a result of the first Everything About God book. I was interviewed on CNN about the everything I always wanted to know about God but were afraid to ask. And the host, Kira Phillips, says to me, now in this book here you mentioned something historical about William Wilberforce. Tell me about that. And I thought, you know, in a few-minute interview, for her to ask about the paragraph I wrote about Wilberforce was just crazy, because I was talking about people who took the Bible seriously. Right. And it changed the world. Wilberforce took the Bible seriously, and it changed the whole world. And so I mentioned something, and as a result of that little moment on CNN, I was contacted by the publisher and said, would you like to write a biography about Wilberforce? Now, Chuck Colson had always talked about Wilberforce. Os Guinness, who's a friend, always talked about Wilberforce. And I always thought of Wilberforce as a hero, but I really never thought I'd write a biography about him. And the more research I did, the more I was impressed. The more I thought, what an extraordinary human being. And we need to know that there have been people who have lived lives in obedience to Jesus Christ who have been the most winsome, delightful, inspirational human beings, that they have changed the world. And I said, we need to tell these stories. And so I wanted to write a book about Wilberforce, because I thought we need to know the full story. He did a lot more than bring about the abolition of the slave trade. He was used by God to change the whole of the British Empire and the West. I mean, that sounds like an overstatement, but if you read my book, Amazing Grace, you'll see it is not. He was used amazingly. So it's a very, very inspiring story, and I wanted to share that.
What about the character Newton? What did you find out about him?
I assume you're talking about John Newton.
Yes.
And not Isaac Newton.
Not Isaac, no. John.
I haven't written about Isaac Newton. John Newton, what did I find out about him? Well, that's a lot of people know about him. There are a number of books written about him. But the fact that this is another person who, you know, here he was a slave trader, one of the most horrifying jobs a human being could have. And when you read my book, Amazing Grace, you realize it's worse than I thought. I mean, it's awful. But that somehow God reaches in and somehow manages to get to this guy, turn his life around. He didn't give up the slave trade right away, which is really stunning and should be really humbling to Christians. You think that God doesn't solve all the problems, that sometimes it takes time, it takes years. But that here's a guy who eventually repented deeply, and his testimony was used when Wilberforce was in Parliament trying to convince members of Parliament why we need to abolish the slave trade. It was the testimony in part of John Newton, who said, I experienced this, I lived this. Let me tell you what this is like, and you tell me, as a supposedly Christian nation, which England claimed to be at the time, you tell me how you countenance this and how it's legal for us to do this. So, yeah, he was used powerfully by God at the end of his life. Of course, he was a great preacher for decades.
Yeah.
There's a story.
And of course, he's written probably the best known hymn of all time, Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound. Just about a minute and a half left. Do you have any other writing projects that are kind of there on the back burner, about to come onto the front burner?
I've got a lot of things. I want to write a book called Finding God at Yale. There's a wonderful book called Finding God at Harvard, which was written by a friend of mine. And of course, I went to Yale, and I did not find God at Yale. But there's such an extraordinary number of Christians who over the centuries have been at Yale, and there's such a Christian history to so many institutions, not just Yale. But I want to write that book, and I've got another book I want to write, which there's an essay on my website called "Does God Want Us to Change the World?" where I talk a little bit about Wilberforce and a number of other things, and I want to write a book sort of based on those ideas about what it means to serve God and to serve man. So the title of that book will probably be To Serve Man, Not a Cookbook. It's a little Twilight Zone joke.
You have a wife and a daughter?
Yes, I do.
How old is your daughter?
I won't deny that. I have a wife and I won't tell you my wife's age,
No.
but my daughter, I will tell you, she'll be 11 this very week, and we just love her to death.
Does your wife read your books?
She tries not to, but she feels obligated to read them, and she's reading my Bonhoeffer book right now.
She is?
Yes.
And do you expect your daughter will read your books?
Well, my daughter has already read some of them. She's pretty precocious, but yeah, it's a daunting thing to think that my daughter will be reading my Bonhoeffer book.
Well, no kidding. Well, it's just a joy. The book is called Everything You Always Wanted to Know About God But Were Afraid to Ask. The Jesus edition is published by Regal Books. Eric Metaxas is the author, and it is a very delightful read and very, very informative and interesting. A lot of scripture, of course, you refer to, but just the Q&A approach. If you've got a friend who is kind of struggling, with the idea of faith, pick this book up, read it for yourself, and then pass it on to them, or better yet, for Eric's sake, encourage them to buy one for themselves, right?
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
My pleasure.